Alright everybody, I absolutely love this chapter because with the introduction of the rain god or potentially rain goddess Zaza, it feels like we are on our way to confirming a lot of the things that I've been talking about in recent times. If you look through some of my most recent videos, I'm talking about the god fruits in One Piece and how in the final saga, we are approaching the point where a lot of the gods that have been mentioned throughout the story are going to start being represented through the form of devil fruits, and Oda's been saving this for the finale of One Piece. And literally just last video, I was talking about the potential of Dragon having the rain god fruit, which would therefore mean that the man marked by flames likely has the missing wind Logia. So just like that, two pieces perfectly click into place. But I have a bigger video on all that coming this Tuesday that I think is going to be really interesting, so wait to check that out. But I would say that the fact is that with this chapter, with Oda once again invoking another deity in One Piece, and even showing us a depiction of what they look like, I think it's safe to say that the floodgates are now open. Oda is making it clear that the gods are going to be important concepts in One Piece, meaning that there are going to be more god fruits than just Luffy. Luffy obviously has the only official confirmed god fruit with the sun god, but at this point it is strongly hinted at that Imu has some sort of devil fruit, and in my opinion, likely the sea devil that has been referenced at the story. It is also genuinely being teased at this point that Chopper just has the forest god fruit and Oda has been hiding it, and now with the rain goddess being presented to us, it's just like, okay Oda, tell us who it is. Somebody's gonna have this rain god or rain goddess fruit. We know it's coming. Let's just get prepared, and that means that we're also looking now at the earth god fruit and so on, and I have ideas on that as well, which will come down the line. So this is just frankly very, very exciting. This was always the end game of devil fruits. Oda started really simple with devil fruit concepts like, oh, you can split apart into pieces, or oh, you can change your weight, and then cooler stuff like elementals, like turning into light, into fire and everything, and then mythical concepts like Phoenix and Dragon, and now we are at the finale of the story, and we're dealing with literally the sun god, the sea devil, the rain god. Just crazy cool concepts that Oda was holding in his back pocket for the finale.
We interrupt this broadcast for a public service announcement.
Pirate activity is up, but don't let that discourage you from getting around. The world government invites you to visit our vast and beautiful world. Become mesmerized by the astounding city of Water 7. Take in the thrills of our very popular Shaboti Park and drink in the beauty of the Whale Forest. Each historic national monument and park contains collector stickers that can be collected. For this month only, buy 2 posters, get 2 and their corresponding stickers free. The world government is excited and invites you to explore. Just hit the link in the description below. Now getting into the meat of the chapter, Loki is still going strong against Imu. Loki is at this point doing extraordinarily well for such an injured man. I mean, he was heavily handicapped even before the fight, and yet he was still clearly able to make Imu bleed, as we saw at the beginning of this chapter. Now granted, that was through a lucky shot where Imu kinda just took it, but the fact that Loki is still up and kicking against God himself while not being in anywhere close to his best shape is just really impressive for this character. It's clear that Imu is stronger than Loki, handicap or no handicap, but I remember a lot of people thinking that Loki would last 1 chapter at best, but now this is comfortably a multi-chapter fight. Loki might still be going next chapter. And I love what Oda clarified in this chapter for us, which was kind of the synergy between Loki and Ragnar, because I've always felt that, you know, some abilities are just naturally congruent, obviously water and ice, or lightning and fire, and there are some abilities that have interesting combinations just because they're kind of opposites, so it's cool to seeing them together, like if a character can use fire and ice. But lightning and ice just never seemed that intuitive to me when Oda kind of presented it, but that was part of the reason I always thought that it was cool. It was like, okay, Loki's got these crazy powerful lightning powers, but he also has ice powers? You don't normally see characters have that specific combination of abilities. Now I already thought it was cool that Loki had 2 very different types of powers at his disposal, but this chapter kind of brought them together and explained how they work in tandem. And Oda really gave me a science lesson here. Maybe I learned this back in, middle school or something like that, but I did not know that ice particles colliding is what creates lightning. And I did Google it after reading this chapter. I was like, wait, is Oda just making something up? Is this One Piece logic? But no, he gave me a science lesson here. That's really cool that lightning and ice actually have a lot of synergy, and I think most authors in fiction and in manga haven't actually tapped into that fact, so big props to Oda on this. Seeing Loki and Ragnar's combo attack being launched on Imu and then Imu firing back, it really feels like this giant aerial firefight, like a sort of modern day battle that you might see in the skies. Crazy stuff, and Imu obviously gives us two little interesting lore drops, which is one, he considers Nidhogg to be a traitor, and two, it's confirmed that Ragnar is a hammer that ate the mythical Ratatoskr fruit. Now, the Nidhogg being a traitor idea is very interesting, but it actually tracks with what we know from the past. So if you check out my recent video talking about how we already know who the Elbaf god of war is, one thing I dive into in great detail is how the previous user of the Nidhogg fruit, while initially an enemy of the previous Nika user, is clearly implied to have become a friend and ally to the Nika user later on. That's why the Giants of Elbaf hold both their god of war and the sun god in equally high regard. They're not treated as conflicting beings or one's evil, one's good by the Giants, and the prophecies that the Giants have passed down about the return of Nidhogg and Nika has always referenced them coming together as a duo, implying a friendship or a bond there. There's lots more arguments about why the God of War and this Nika user likely did become friends in the end, but the point being that what Imu just dropped here makes perfect sense with what I was talking about before, in that if we just look at what little we know of the history of the Void Century, somehow the 20 Kings were rallied together to turn against Joy Boy's faction, but it's heavily implied that there was a lot of deception at play, likely on the part of Imu. Now, we already know some characters like Lily were originally on Imu and the 20 Kings side in turning against Joy Boy and the Ancient Kingdom, but at some point, Lily seems to have realized that she made a mistake and turned against Imu instead and worked against him. This tracks perfectly with what we're learning about the story of the God of War and the previous Nika user, Prickly Joy Boy. I wouldn't be surprised if Imu had also turned this God of War against Joy Boy. That is how they had their legendary duel, but of course at some point the God of War realized that Nika and this whole faction are not the bad guys. The real bad guys are of course Imu and them. So much like Lily, that Nidhogg user turned against Imu, hence why Imu refers to Nidhogg as a traitor here. So we're seeing a sort of similar pattern, right? Everybody that Imu calls a traitor, right? Lily, the previous Nidhogg user. These are characters who were once on the wrong side of history going up against Joy Boy, but who at some point seem to have realized their mistake and swapped sides. So it makes me all the more interested in what happened with the Void Century. Of course, it's going to be some time before we get that. Now, beyond all that, we get Zoro and Sanji back in action, and it seems like we're going to get Sanji versus Killingham and Zoro versus Sommers, which I will say, frankly, straight up, I am not the most excited for these two matchups, because at this point, I think Oda has done a lot to kind of grind Killingham and Sommers' reputations into the dirt. Sommers is currently the world record holder of One Piece characters who have taken the most L's from the most characters in the shortest amount of time, and unfortunately they were all low difficulty. In less than 20 chapters, we saw this man get stomped by Gaban, Rayleigh, Loki, and Luffy. All extremely powerful characters, of course, but in terms of the feeling that all of these defeats evoke in me, the reader, the feeling of Sommers as a threat is hard to take serious. And while we can talk about all of these Sommers defeats, on the flip side, Killingham was defeated off-screen, which is arguably just as, if not more embarrassing. Now, there's two big differences here, which is that one, of course, we have the Omen involved now, so Sommers and Killingham are much stronger in this moment. But at the same time, while I know that logically they're a lot stronger now, as characters, I no longer feel that excited for them because I know that they're essentially being carried by power-up from God. So whereas, with Zoro versus King or Zoro versus Mr. One, I still felt like the opponent that Zoro was up against was a really cool opponent in their own right, I'm not going to feel that way about Sommers or about Killingham. And it's also just really hard to gauge now how we are supposed to understand the level of challenge that each of these characters pose, because we don't really have a clear idea of how much Omen buffs them, and it was already difficult to determine how strong Sommers was, considering how many characters defeated him with little difficulty. And Killingham, we don't really get to see anything. However, in Killingham's case, the second point I wanted to bring up is that it is becoming more and more apparent that Killingham's strength really is not his upfront fighting. The reality is that Killingham does have an extremely powerful ability, in fact one of the strongest abilities we've seen in One Piece, that makes him a ridiculously powerful backline fighter. I mean, Killingham essentially, through his MMA army, soloed Elbaf by himself. It's just that when you see how he does on his own in fights, it ruins his image a little bit. But we're obviously getting the reminder here that, look, Killingham's abilities are mainly about creating these really powerful monstrosities, and Zaza seems to be trump card. So maybe it's better not to judge Killingham's fighting strength, but rather the fighting strength of this Zaza being that's created. And I wouldn't be surprised if that actually is a legitimate challenge. And I will say that one of my favorite things about this chapter was the little Zoro-Sanji moment we got, where Zoro's heading towards Somers, he sees what's going on with Zaza in the village, and then he's asked like, hey, shouldn't we go help out there? But Zoro also spots Sanji heading over, and Zoro's just like, nah, it'll be okay. I love that Zoro and Sanji, no matter how much they disrespect each other to their faces, underneath that, they both have a deep respect for one another's capabilities, and they have absolute confidence that the other person can handle pretty much any situation. So great Zoro-Sanji stuff here. I will say that the conclusion of this chapter, with Zoro and Sanji getting set up with new opponents, does make me feel like they're going to be able to beat their opponents without maybe too much difficulty, and that we're heading towards a team battle to try to drive Ino out. And before we get into the review of the rest of the chapter, I just want to say that if you enjoy this channel, if you enjoy the content, well, you can start listening to these videos on Spotify. We have just launched on Spotify. Go follow the link and give it a follow. Pretty soon, all the videos on this channel are going to be on Spotify, and maybe even some content that's been removed from this channel. So just hit the link in the description below and give us a follow. And finally, we have a very interesting point about Biblo from one of my top tier of patrons. So let's listen to the voice of the people. So Professor Fourleaf said, Biblo is looking sus. Could he be the man marked by flames, or the key to finding him? I can't help but think of the owl in Ocarina of Time. So Biblo is a very, very interesting little question mark in this arc, and it reminds me a lot of Emmet and Zunisha, where we had in these arcs between Zoe and Egghead Island this silent, dormant character the whole time, but then who by the end of the arc was revealed to actually be a very significant character, presumably from the Void Century, who has survived on till the modern day, and very possibly a former ally of Joy Boy's. So that is my current belief regarding what Biblo actually is. But I'll save more of my thoughts on that for a future video. So with that, I'm giving this chapter an 8 out of 10, and I will talk to you all next week.